Hello all, and welcome to another production of History is Told by Professor T. In this unit, we will be looking at the 1920s and the 1930s, the so-called interwar period between the two 20th century world wars. For this episode, we will look at the 1920s. This was a time of great economic expansion that enabled cultural and societal shifts in the United States. Traditional interpretations about social and cultural norms were challenged by these newfound economic freedoms and opportunities, while America struggled to identify what were the country's core values. We see in this time period the Great Migration expand, and a phenomenon in Harlem, New York bring into question long-held assertions about African American culture. We see mass production in agriculture and industry pave the way for more affordable consumerism, and a government more than willing to embrace extreme laissez-faire policies that let industry and the economy fly free. All the while, alcohol manufacture was stopped by prohibition, leading to the rise of organized crime and a network of contraband enjoyment in all pockets of the country. This was the Jazz Age, the so-called Roaring Twenties, a celebration of new social highs and dangerous practices. One could buy into the stock market for a whopping 10% margin buy-in, speculating that the stock would pay for itself in the short term. Folks in the middle and lower class could actually purchase consumer goods on credit and give the appearance that they enjoyed a lifestyle of higher class households. The country engaged in American First ideology that ignored international trade and led to a convenient place of isolation among the world powers of the day. So let's get into it, the Roaring Twenties. Alright, let's take a look at where we came from in the previous unit of American imperialism. Also, when America became a global industrial and military power. So, Albert Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, was very influential and was read by a lot of what would become the war hawks at this turn to the 20th century, namely including Theodore Roosevelt. So, this book had this premise that if you wanted to become a great empire, if you wanted to become a great any kind of nation, you had to control the seas, the oceans, and whatever waterways you possibly could that connected your empire. And those guiding principles had pretty much worked for, in its case, many different empires, most recently at this time, the British Empire. So America wanted to create a navy also to start to expand. It wanted to be this continuation of the westward expansion movement that had pushed America from sea to shining sea for the 120 years before this period. Now, we're going to do imperialism a little differently, America does, and they have this idea that since we're going to try to bring the best of our values and our systems, our economies, if you will, to these other territories, then we're going to try to convince them that this is the right way to do it. And, of course, that's still going to have a pretty strong upper hand, which keeps it as American imperialism. So as we're expanding abroad, looking for more natural resources and control of them, some deep water harbors, especially natural harbors such as we found in Hawaii, we're taking over territories, and we're still kind of leaving a bad taste in a lot of places around the world, especially in Latin America. And we can't really figure out how do we actually justify a lot of this. One justification for it came that other countries were doing it. Another justification, well, we're bringing Christianity to these folk. So it was justifiable through right there with religious motives. But we come to this question of just a few miles south of our borders in Florida with the island of Cuba, where Spain is unfortunately breaking our Monroe Doctrine Treaty and saying that they're not doing anything there, but our press is getting out a lot of issues. Now, the press this time, the media, tends to follow this idea of what we call yellow journalism, or what today is more tabloid journalism. It's sensationalism, it's extremism. It's a lot of exaggerations and sometimes just made up stuff, but it prints and it's a good read, especially for those who like to just look through headlines and say, I know exactly what that article is all about because I read the headline, and there's stuff going on. Well, this was going on still back then at the turn of the 20th century. So Spain was, of course, doing some pretty nasty stuff, but Spain was also trying to reform some things. Too little, too late, unfortunately. The USS Maine blows up in Havana, Cuba harbor, and it starts the war. It becomes our rallying cry. And at the end of this war in 1898, America gets this little pocket of islands in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. We get Guam, we get Puerto Rico, we get parts of Cuba, even though we signed amendments saying that, we're not really going to take over all your territory unless your economy totally, stinks or something. Then we might come in. But we get all this new territory, and now it's like, well, we're a free-loving people who now own other people's land. And the Filipinos were really confused by this because they were under the impression all along, apparently, during the Spanish-American War, that we were going to give them freedom, which we do in the 1940s. But for now, we're like, you're not quite ready to be free. We got to teach you what it means to be free. Far be it from us to, tell somebody else how to run their own people. So we have a lot of disconnects. We have a lot of paradoxes. We have a lot of double talk. And each president after Teddy Roosevelt is going to have a different view of the world. And that kind of creates even worse relationships with our near neighbors in Latin America. So let's go through them in brief. Big stick diplomacy. This is Teddy's hallmark idea. It's his hallmark saying. If you remember anything on Teddy Roosevelt, this is probably one of them when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, speak softly but carry a big stick, you'll go far. What a great way to live your life. What a great way to run a foreign policy. So Teddy Roosevelt essentially is out here saying that when we're negotiating things and when we're trying to help your people out, especially in Latin America, we're going to do things to a certain degree, but understand that at the back end of everything is the U.S. military, and it will invade your country, and it will stabilize your country for you if it has to forcibly, and it does. His quasi-successor, quasi meaning, not quite real, but sort of chosen successor, Howard Taft, comes in. And Taft gets this interesting idea that, well, we want to have more of a dollar diplomacy. We want to put money out there and just try to get people to understand how our system's so awesome. And yet he still uses the military. So it's kind of like, I guess, big stick diplomacy, soft version. And then we have Woodrow Wilson, who gets elected in 1912. So in 1913, when he's coming into office, he introduces a new diplomacy called moral diplomacy, which sounds awesome and spiffy and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, too, he uses the American military to invade, to force negotiations. Because at the root of the moral diplomacy idea is that we want you to be morally like us. And even more than just morally like us, but economically and infrastructurally. We want everything that you do to kind of be a model of America light. And that's not the way you make friends. So we enter into World War I with a lot of animosity towards the United States, a lot in Latin America, and that has kind of continued also into the 21st century. And in World War I, we're essentially selling to both sides for a while. And then we get brought into the war. And America's only in the war for a couple months in retrospect, looking at how long other countries were fighting. But America has a big impact on ending it. And so big an impact that our president actually goes over and by himself, not sending an ambassador or somebody, like a skilled statesman, but he fancies himself the skilled statesman of the era. And he is going to actually represent the country at the Versailles Peace Accords. He brings with him these 14 points, fine and dandy, the majority of them. But the people there start to realize that Wilson doesn't really speak for the American public anymore. He's losing a lot of favor. And he made a really terrible mistake on not bringing any really high-ranking Republican who owned the House and the Senate this time. He didn't bring any of them over to help out with the peace negotiations. So when he brings back the Versailles Treaty, the U.S. Senate looks at it like, well, the Senate has to ratify this, and we don't really like this. You're basically giving control of our country to someone else. That's not cool. And George Washington, frankly, warned us about getting involved in those kind of entangling alliances. So the Versailles Treaty doesn't actually get the American signature until it's been amended a few times. And then we actually make a whole new treaty to officially end the war with Germany. That's weird. So that's where America finds itself in 1920. And the election of Harding ushers in this new normalcy, as he calls it. And he's like, we're going to return to this isolationism. We're going to stop the progressive era. We're going to take a look at where we've actually evolved into and what we've adapted into as a country, both domestically and foreign. And we're just going to take a toll here and see what we can do about ourselves and our own country first. That sets up some problems for the 1920s. So the 1920s in American history was a decade of a lot of challenging of the rules and status quo that existed beforehand. We see, especially in the cities, this larger population boom happening that actually creates its own form of ideology. We're just going to call it modernism or urban thinking. And it's going to bring a lot of challenges to traditional or fundamental ideas that had previously been held throughout American society and American culture. We also have this time here, especially in the 20s, with this jazz music and the speakeasies going on as they're defying prohibition, that really makes the population what we call roaring. They're more exuberant, they're more freewheeling, if you will. And this type of culture is different for American values, but it becomes a majority because by this decade, the 1920s, we have a majority of our citizenry living inside cities instead of in rural areas. So that's a major shift in American history and American demographics. We have this rise of organized crime in the 1920s that, yeah, sure, there's always been some kind of organized crime, but not on this scale. Prohibition creates organized crime in this country on a level that we've never previously seen. And in the decade, the FBI is also going to have to start arming themselves, and they become what we call a gun-toting agency, a gun-toting federal agency at that point. And they're actually having to figure out how to counter some of the prohibition organized crime syndicates. We have mass consumerism, and consumerism, as I would define it, is this kind of ideology that you feel like you want something because you have to have it because that's just something in society. If you take a look at today, our biggest consumerism target, I would say, is probably cell phones. It's like whenever one comes out, everyone wants to have one. Everyone has this inherent need within them to go get the new one. And as it turned out, some cell phone providers were actually creating cell phones and intentionally slowing them down after they were a year old. So, isn't that interesting? But that's the idea of consumerism. And let's face it, consumerism like that is drawing its power and influence off of advertising. In the 1920s, the main focus for advertising was the radio. And if you look at communication advertising throughout the last 2 centuries, we have this move that really wants to get people thinking a little bit different on what they actually need or what they want. And the real devices that push that are going to be the telegraph. And then, once we have the telegraph, we're doing like Sears Roebuck's ordering throughout all the train stations. Trains along with that, I would say, are probably a big form of advertising because there's a lot of new connectedness throughout the country. Then we have the telephone itself. Isn't that interesting? So the telephone actually allows you to go out and say, call Sears Roebuck and just place an order. And sure enough, you go pick it up. And then you end up also evolving into now the radio. And after the radio, think about what replaces it. We have the internet eventually. We have today's modern World Wide Web. We have, in between there, we have email that develops. We have faster mail. We have the U.S. Postal Service that at one point was actually pretty decent throughout the country. So this consumerism creates this inherent and believed need and want for certain items. And let's face it, when you see someone who you think is in your income bracket or who may live, say, like the Joneses next door, and they have something, well, you want something. And that is also going to carry over into something as big as the automobile, which becomes much more affordable in the 1920s. Now we have people gambling with their wealth, and I don't mean, going to, let's say, Las Vegas or something and gambling away on slots. That was going on too, sure. but I mean actually taking your income and over speculating so much that you're actually going to go take your income, the majority of it, and put it into the stock market, believing, based on the math that you've seen on a certain stock, that that money that you've put into it is going to raise and eventually pay for itself. And these get-rich-quick schemes, they kind of happen for a lot of people. But if you understand how the stock market works, if you're not actually buying 100% value of the stock, then let's say like the stock market back then hits, I don't know, let's just make up a number, let's say like 1,000 points. That could potentially mean that only like 100 of those 1,000 points, 10%, were actually already backed by hard currency and bought by our standards of today illegally. Back then, you could go on and get a borrowed loan from a bank or a broker or someone else and buy on margin that 10% down fee. Not today. And then we have women. Women as a gender in this country have had these traditional stereotypical roles. And those were heavily challenged at the end of the 20th century because especially during World War I, we saw women, we saw other demographics like Mexican Americans, we saw African Americans all step up and do not just their quote-unquote fair share during World War I, but go above and beyond what was thought that their particular demographics could do. And that changed the paradigm and the argument against allowing women to have the vote. So when women finally get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, well, now they have the right to vote. They're even more so equal citizens. So how are we going to actually bring in this new voting population? So some women, if you take a look at what's going on inside the cities, they take this newfound independence and they create what we call the flapper culture. Because now that they've challenged the argument against them voting, what else can they challenge? Do they have to be secretaries? Or could they be dancers? Could they be musicians? Could they actually run businesses and the such? And there are a couple cases here and there, like women actually pull that off. One notable inclusion that we've talked about before is Madam C.J. Walker, who during the Gilded Age, all the way through here in the early 20th century, I mean, let's face it, makeup and other beauty supplies, that becomes a consumerism target for a woman population. And she knew how to market it, and she knew how to make money off of it. And it creates a whole new business and a whole new market even. We have the government in the 1920s, led by, if you look at it, 3 Republican presidents back to back to back. And they embraced this ideology of laissez-faire, which is all fine and dandy. Sure, the government, most would say, should do a little less than they should for protecting the economy and business, but not nothing. Understand, when I say extreme laissez-faire, I mean these presidents essentially actually appointed advisors who were kind of corrupt, especially in the Harding administration, into areas of the economy and business they really had no, business overseeing. And it created some scandals, such as the Teapot Dome scandal, because we had our oil supply traditionally and historically controlled and taken care of by the U.S. Navy. And then we're going to give it to a private company. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? And of course, some people made some money off that. So that creates a scandal for the president. And we have this embracing of extreme laissez-faire to the point to where we have a president actually say that the business of America is business. Well, that sounds all fine and dandy, but what about the people who are getting stepped on again? It's almost as if the country forgot completely about what the prior generations had dealt with during the Gilded Age, when extreme laissez-faire also allowed these corporations to create several, what we would consider today by our standards, billionaires, and how they actually got their wealth. So it's an interesting balance. It's an ongoing debate. How much authority should government have over the economy and over business oversight, especially over looking the stock market, for instance? And you see this point, I would argue, in 1929 when the stock market finally crashes in October. Up to that point, you have this argument on whether or not government should be involved in the business and whether or not the government should be involved in the economy. After 1929, that argument doesn't really exist anymore. And even today, if you listen to some of our candidates running for office in the past few elections, and probably for the next few coming up as well, it's no longer a question of should the government be involved, but now it's a question of how much should the government actually be involved in the economy and business? And so we have different ideologies, and we have, of course, different anecdotes or examples that we can pull from throughout our history. The 1920s is kind of this pivotal moment to where we no longer, as a people, I would argue, actually have that question of if the government should be involved, but now, how much? Okay, so the second American Industrial Revolution, that's essentially what we're going to call the 1920s as far as like agriculture and industrial might is concerned. If you look at the European countries, they're all war-torn. Germany completely disheveled, essentially. Britain heavily attacked. France, I mean, let's face it, hundreds of thousands of miles of trenches have been dug and battles have been fought. Austria, all these famous European territories just ruined by this war. And at the end of the war, well, if you're on the losing side, you're actually paying those war reparations back to the Western powers that won the war. So, you're already down on your knees, and then you essentially get shot in your stomach as well. I mean, how on earth are you supposed to recover from that? So a lot of those countries were having some pretty awful times. We'll get into that with foreign policy. But in America, man, we didn't really have any of that problem. If you think about it, America, because it stayed out of the war all the way until the middle part of 1917, we were able to essentially develop our industry. We were able to make war materials. We were able to take our farms, and it's kind of showboaty to say, but think about the sheer volume of food products that America had been able to make during World War I and get to its allies once we entered the war. We were essentially feeding our populations who were fighting in the Allied advances. So there's a lot of farm goods being created. And the problem with all this is that at the end of the war, no company and no major farm, I mean, of course the smaller farms are going to cut back because, they're just subsistence farming. But the major farms did not really scale back their production. And that's where it becomes a little dangerous. And the farmers actually, I would say, go into their Great Depression potentially 10 years before the rest of the country really realized, this stinks. Maybe we shouldn't be making as much and making prices so cheap. And of course, there's other factors in it. But for the farmers, they really experienced the Great Depression a lot sooner than the rest of the population. Now, the USA had come out of World War I as this richest and most developed country in the world, and that's not exaggeration. We had really avoided any kind of domestic problems there were no battles fought here. We didn't have New York City ravaged or something like that. And because we had been able to avoid all these problems during World War I, our industry had done what American industries do best. They innovate, and especially when they're encouraged to innovate for the production, in this case, of war materials. So at the end of war material production, they're simply going to take what they learned from the war and how to produce these great big things needed for success in the war and kind of translate that over to, this is what the American consumer wants now. Let's get to those. So wages are going up, hours are going down just naturally. There's this wide access to these new consumer ideas and goods. We have pamphlets being mass-produced in numbers we've never seen before. Newspapers, journals, or these are things that are actually being read by the population at this time. We have early movies that finally get an actual talk script to them. They call them the talkies. We call them movies today, but they were talkies back then. And these consumer goods and this consumerist idea that all Americans should have these types of things really bolster and just encourage the industries to continue to innovate and to continue to make things that the American public wants. Some of those, for instance, cars. Let's face it. Henry Ford actually wanted to pay his workers enough money so that his own workers could buy a Model T Ford. Now, that's noble and all. That's great. That's, frankly, why don't other business owners take that kind of initiative as well? And some do. I'm not saying all don't. But at the same time, when he's making cars so quickly and so cheaply, he's also bringing that price down, so he has to produce more to keep up. And then think about what changes in our country because of mass production of automobiles such as the Model T. Now we need sturdy roads, we need filling stations, we need more steel, we need more access to oil and gasoline, the petrol products that lubricate the engine and cause the engine to actually burn energy and run. We're also going to need upholstery. I mean, let's face it, we need leather seats inside our cars, because back then they didn't really use the cotton textiles inside cars. That comes a little bit later. They want them with leather. And then they also need rubber for the tires, and rubber's not cheap. So once again, we're looking for our American imperial holdings to kind of bring that rubber sourcing in as well. So there's a lot of industries that are kind of spurned on by the automobile industry, and a lot of them are interconnected to it. We also take a look at our energy needs. Let's face it, as the country is moving into a majority population living in cities, you want electricity. I mean, it becomes almost like a core necessity, really. And think of our lives today. If you didn't have electricity in your home, what are you doing? You know, it's a very interesting prospect, and it becomes a need for our society. And it's going to replace steam power very quickly. We have this national brand imaging coming across from the advertisements of the day. Think of it this way. Would you rather buy a, let's not say store brand, but some like lesser known brand, let's say like a small family in the middle part of Houston is packaging up a t-shirt or something. Would you want to buy from them for $20 a t-shirt? Or would you rather buy from, say, Adidas or Nike or Columbia or any of these other bigger brands, these national brands, when they could offer it because they're able to mass produce it better for $10? And when you feel the two shirts, so they're similar in quality build, so it's not a question of quality. You're probably going to choose the cheaper option. So these big national brands really become the national thing to get. Along with that, we have this new middle class and new lower upper class, if you follow my thinking here, of industry thinkers and organizers. Now, sure, we've always had plant managers. That's something that comes along with the first industrial revolutions, even in Europe. But now we're actually thinking logistically, how do we actually expand our enterprise? And how do we make things even bigger and more efficient? The Model T, for example, goes from a couple hours to make one to a couple minutes. I mean, that's really, really ridiculously fast. And it's all from efficiency. And it takes somebody thinking and challenging the way that we were doing things to continue the innovative process. So along with all these new consumerist needs and wants in society, American business is really going to latch onto it and make things available. All right, let's continue. Now, and women, the experience for women in the 1920s is something unique. If you remember the Progressive Era and the women marching for their suffrage rights and for prohibition, essentially, and other temperance ideas, they were a very activist subpopulation. And now in the 1920s, women essentially go one of two ways. We have the more free-loving women who embrace the flapper culture, and that's all fine and dandy. We also have the other half of the women who will actually go into more traditional roles. I mean, think about it. Women had proved that they could do anything they wanted to during World War I. That's awesome. They ran our war material factories, essentially, while the men were out fighting. As sexist as it sounds, too, think about how when the men come back from war, do women actually want to continue working in those industries? Or do they want to go to some of the more stereotypical employments? And that's for each woman to decide herself. But the statistics show that a lot of women actually wanted to go back into the house and have these lower paying jobs. So we're talking about teaching, we're talking about nursing, secretarial jobs, part-time labor essentially. But their experience at the home was different now, because they had these new massive appliances. Like here on the screen, we have the electric range. We have the refrigerator from General Electric. We also have vacuums. We have washing machines. Things that made homemaking easier, especially for the middle class. So if you wanted to have a near nuclear family with a mother, a father, and some kids, you were probably going to have a lot of these appliances at home. And as advertising grew through the means of radio, a lot of billboards, because let's face it, there's a lot of streets people are with their cars on, newspapers, other mail outlets such as pamphlets or journals, the talkies, and even sport events. You can't go anywhere in society without getting this message that you deserve this, and this is the new norm. And why doesn't your wife have an electric range or an electric refrigerator? So the condition for women changed significantly. Further from that, we take a look at how many women actually go and use their voting right now. And some statistics point to as much as 36% vote in the 1920 elections. Now, it's interesting to look at because election statistics had made it unlawful to really track gender voting in 1920 because of the 19th Amendment. So these are just some of the best guesses that other economists and historians have put together. But that's still only like 1 out of 3 eligible women go to vote. Now, why is that? You should wonder. I would say it's probably because it's something new. You fight for the right to vote because it's going to allow all these other avenues for you to pursue as a gender. And they did. But going to the voting booth, it's kind of very similar to the African American experience. Even if you have the right to do so, do you? Because when you get there, there's discrimination, and you're openly walking into it. And openly walking into adversarial conditions like that is not for everyone. So maybe that was a part of it, maybe not. But as the men are returning home and women are largely moving back into households, the family sizes are actually dropping. And there's a couple of reasons for it. Think about how much of a need you have if you who are watching actually live in a city. I mean, do you actually want to have, say, 5 children? Or is it because there's an economic burden to having children that you don't really want to have that many? Maybe 1 or 2 because, yes, you want to be a parent, but maybe not 5 because that gets very expensive and they're not really carrying their weight, if you think about it, till they're 16 and employed. And even then, that's just part-time entry-level work. If you were on a farm, however, you probably would want to have as many kids as possible because even as early as like age 5 to 8, you can actually count on them to do some menial labor and help out. And that takes time off of the man of the household or the staff who was working for the farm, depending on the size of this farm, to get things done. But in general, because the majority of population is now urban, meaning living in cities, we don't necessarily want to, as a society, have these larger families anymore. And if you look at the general trends in human geography, when you actually see an advanced people move to cities being their majority place of living, the birth rates decline. There's also a good argument to be made that perhaps this is also due to increased access to birth control. That's probably it as well. But as we see this change in the American family, things are going on. And the teens who are being raised during the 1920s with all this new status quo, these new normals as becoming their normal experience as well, it's interesting to look at how much the teens rebel. Every generation, teens rebel to whatever extent they possibly can. But that's even made it more accessible for this generation and every generation after this one, because there's so much more technology and consumer ideas and consumerist wants out there and just general things that you need to really be a good teen rebel. So we see a massive change in the family structure and the experience of women. And for better or for worse, this is what America embraces for its society in the 1920s, leading up to the Great Depression. So what about the African American population in the 1920s? Well, they were undergoing what we call the Great Migration. It's give or take a few million, I guess, but about 6 million or so we estimate African Americans migrate from the farms, especially sharecropping farms, where, let's face it, you're not really set up for much expansion or prosperity for your family. If you're a sharecropper, you're there for temporary labor, and you end up paying fees to the one who owns the actual sharecrop land anyways to rent their tools and whatnot, so there's not much opportunity there for your family. But because of World War I, African Americans are going to start moving into cities, especially Northeast and Midwest cities, because, let's face it, that's where the jobs are for creation of war materials. So they also are going to create these neighborhoods. And one of the melting pots that pops up is the Harlem area in New York City. We're going to call this moment in time the Harlem Renaissance. In this, we have jazz and blue musics from artists such as really famous Louis Armstrong and others. This becomes mainstream, and of course it gets kind of appropriated into also white culture, but it starts with the African American culture here, and it becomes pretty common. And Langston Hughes and other poets are going to start writing things along this idea that, maybe the racial views of African Americans is unfounded and kind of silly, that it's just being continued and perpetuated from generation to generation. Along that, we have different African American artists who are actually in films, who are singing on stage, who are being very successful at the time, especially African American females at this time, are being very successful in these kind of avenues for work. And it challenges a lot of held beliefs and stereotypes and prejudices against the African American population. Marcus Garvey comes onto the scene here in the 1920s with his idea that we should take the African American populations, and instead of dealing with what's going on with Jim Crow laws and segregation, we should just move to West Africa, to a country known as Liberia. Now, Marcus Garvey, not everyone likes him. Even W.B. Du Bois has some choice words to say of the guy and his character. But Marcus Garvey is going to start the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and the Black Star Line. Now, the Black Star Line is meant to be an alternative to the White Star Line. The White Star Line is this shipping company and cruise company for essentially Anglo-Americans at the time, who were basically able to put some money in and build up this stock and take these ships and make money off it, the international shipping craze after World War I. Black Star Line, however, had a lot of problems. Namely, they would actually purchase some really downridden boats and ships, and they would do so for a lot of money. And then, of course, they would staff it with only African-American staffers. And the crews on board these ships were just fine, but because the ships were in such kind of terrible condition to begin with, even after some pretty heavy renovations, not all of them would actually make it for extended lengths of time. So there was a lot of money lost. And Marcus Garvey would go around to different neighborhoods, and he would actually try to get people to buy stock into his company. One time even saying, $5 investment here can make hundreds of dollars here tomorrow. And just exaggerated ideas like that, once again, get rich quick schemes, really lured in a lot of African Americans into this idea. So the idea that you could falsely advertise things is eventually going to get some federal attention. And we see an organization, the Bureau of Investigation, that would become the FBI eventually here pretty shortly. They actually take a look, a very close look at Marcus Garvey and what he's doing. And they find that on one of his advertisements asking for money for stock, he has a picture of a boat that, yes, the Black Star Line is going to buy, but they haven't at that time purchased yet. It's not actually in their navy yet. So it brings a lot of problems. And what ends up happening is Marcus Garvey is found guilty of this, and he's put in jail. And then President Coolidge later on just gets rid of the guy. He's like, okay, you know what? You're deported back to your home country of Jamaica. And there goes the story of Marcus Garvey. But what we see from this story is that Jim Crow laws and segregation have hit such a critical mass that we have a lot of people, a lot of African Americans, who are willing to do just about anything to get out of it. That should be kind of like a red flag waving in the background of what's going on in America. Sure, there's a lot of nice things and there's excellent growth and good opportunities, but there's a lot of problems underneath the surface, much akin to the Gilded Age being all shiny on top, but having some problems underneath as well. We're essentially repeating that time period here, luckily not quite for as long. Or is it? So there's this plight of African Americans at this time where they're not really sure what side of history they're going to come down on. The Great Migration that I referenced earlier, this is really going to bring economic opportunity into the African American household and family experience. But once you have this congregation of African Americans in major cities, there arises some more civil rights problems. Think of it this way. If, let's say, we have a country in the north, let's say like Detroit, and Detroit is faming itself on, this idea that we don't really have racism problems here. We don't have race riots or anything of that nature. We're all, pro-civil rights for the African American and any other demographic who wants to come here. But then as essentially hundreds of thousands move into the city, well, then your stereotypes do kind of take over. Then your prejudices do kind of take over. It's human nature because it's different. It's new. It's something that you're going to challenge. Not everybody falls into that bandwagon, sure. But by and far, a lot of the northern cities who had prided themselves on being this esteemed experience of freedom and prosperity and democracy and civil rights and whatnot, they don't actually practice that when they're faced with this mass migration of African Americans coming into their cities. Along with this, we have the so-called lost generation of American artists. These are musicians, playwrights, actors, poets, novelists. They're coming of age during World War I, a time where you're seeing this mass death throughout the world. I mean, we're talking tens of millions of people die in World War I and from the Spanish influenza. They're seeing a lack of real democracy and freedom. They're kind of cynical on it. They're very not... I don't want to say that they're like anti-American, because it is one of our values to challenge things, to have a freedom of thought. But they're not really on board with the whole idea of the direction America is going in the 1920s. They see a lot of it as being kind of dangerous even. So they actually challenge a lot of the materialism and consumerism speech and practices of the 1920s. Now, because of their slanted view of America, some of them actually expatriate over to Paris, where they'll be very successful. Some of them stay in America, and actually some of them get jobs from the WPA in the Great Depression. But by and large, this is a group of artists who have essentially lost themselves in the chaos of World War I and what comes afterwards. So while women were looking for what path they wanted to take in 1920s society, and African Americans were choosing where they wanted to migrate to in large numbers, there arose this conflict between traditional American values and those that were developing in the cities. The 1920 census for the first time showed that, sure enough, there were more people living in cities than they were living in rural farm areas. So this had a couple of dynamics to it. Well, one, a lot of the rural people, I mean, let's face it, they're going to be the more religious, the more Protestant, the more standard and status quo American values from our inception. And they viewed the city folk as these saloon-going, communist sympathizing, immoral, elitist, so on and so forth. The despairing comments go on and on. Essentially, the urban dwellers, as they would call them, were actually seen as these people in American society who lacked good values, who lacked Protestant values. So we see the American government actually get behind and sanction this movement that would actually target un-American activities, and it became a really big deal and eventually bred into what we call the first Red Scare. It would repeat again in the 1950s with the second Red Scare, where we actually make the House Un-American Activities Committee. So this has a lot of connectedness to what's going on. But at the heart of all of it is fear and a really hesitant acceptance of the new norm, this new demographic of populations living in cities instead of farms. It didn't go very well. And then you add into the mix that there's a lot of people who want to immigrate to the United States in the 1920s. Well, fear of immigrants from areas that might be kind of communist, might be kind of red, also kind of throw up some flags for a lot of people in the United States this time. This is the atmosphere of the first Red Scare. Now, the temperance movement finally won out with the passage of the 18th Amendment that outlawed the manufacture and distribution of alcohol. Oddly enough, maybe not the actual consumption of it. How about that? So Congress is going to pass 3 years after the passage of this amendment, the Volstead Act of 1920. And it was an attempt for the federal government to actually say, this is how we want to enforce it. This is how we want to get rid of alcohol, especially in the cities. Rural counties had already voted, and for the most part, they were okay with this idea of, yeah, let's go on, let's let's do the right thing here. Let's become a so-called dry county. Urban populations, however, they weren't so accommodating of the new prohibition laws. So they were actually of the mindset that we're going to find a way to get around this. So bootlegging becomes normal. We see illegal manufacture. And let's face it, if you have, let's say, Billy and Tommy working out of their garage making bootlegged alcohol, it's probably not going to be as safely created as, say, Anheuser-Busch or something in their factory for it. So the new alcohol that's being sold during Prohibition largely is actually a little less healthy for you and a lot more dangerous than the alcohol that was being sold previously. What we see is these speakeasies popping up, especially in the urban cities, like the basements and whatnot. And you look at the actual schematics of the building, there is no basement there, but there most certainly is. They would actually build them. They would disguise these and hide them, and let's face it, you have to sometimes bribe off some officials as well to keep your speakeasy working and thriving and whatnot. People need their ale. NASCAR, as we know it today, actually developed from some of the alcohol runners of the time who would actually try to soup up their engines and find ways to increase power from their internal combustion engines to outrun the police. So there's a lot of heritage from Prohibition era that pops around. But does Prohibition actually do anything for the core value of temperance? This idea that alcohol is making us an immoral society, is making our men cheat on their wives, is making our men become very abusive and harass their women as well. Does it actually do anything for that? Not really. You can see, especially in 1921, there's a per capita consumption drop, but in reality, they probably just didn't know how to measure it per se. If you look at it, this is from the Cato Institute and this book here, The Economic Results of Prohibition. Well, what we end up seeing also is that because we're using these higher percentage of alcohol by volume for the majority of brewing during Prohibition, the alcohol that was being consumed, and was being consumed in far greater number as it turns out, was actually really bad. And it was really dangerous for a lot of folks who were drinking it. Along with all this comes the issue of crime, and organized crime specifically, a much higher degree of it, the mafia and the such. We see here on some of our political cartoons here, we have the wet or dry. This is a moral calling to, my family wants to survive. And notice how her husband ain't there in this picture. What does that actually mean for you? Maybe the husband is off cheating on her, or has beat her or the kids, or he's drunk out late at night and he's missing family time. Whereas on the left, you see the actual brewer who's of the mindset that, well, you know what? Let's stay wet as a society and keep me in business. So a lot of these propaganda posters for and against Prohibition were popping up all over the 19-teens. But especially into the 1920s, we start to see the effects of it, and it's not good. We see bootleggers such as the woman here at the top left finding ways to actually get the alcohol transported from the brewers and different crime syndicates as well. Originally, they would actually get their name bootlegger from actually having boots in their leggings and trying to hide it and camouflage it. And some of them are actually pretty sophisticated if you look at them. I mean, look at this truck at the bottom left here. That's a great disguise, right? But of course, once the police and the federal bureaus actually see that once, they've seen it all, right? It's kind of that idea that we now see with some of the car insurance commercials. We've seen it all, so we can insure it all. And also we see in the speakeasies a lot of dance moves that, if all you see is an image of it, you're thinking, man, that is really inappropriate. And a lot of the dancing that was going on, sure, was inappropriate, but it was also expressions of freedom. And dance is dance. It's a form of art. So the organized crime that actually pops up from Prohibition, I would actually argue is probably the biggest effect. And it's a very negative effect on American society, because it's not as if organized crime ever went away. We eventually start seeing murder rates rise for the first time in a long while in American history as well. We start seeing gangs actually in open streets fighting each other, and police bought off or simply, of the mindset they don't want to go get involved with that because they're going to get shot too. We see massive loads of liquor being shipped from Canada and other places and some of the rural areas that don't necessarily want to buy into it, but all in all, there's this there's a lot of problems with prohibition. It's this idea that you can't really, as a government, legislate morality. And it's been tried in numerous cultures and societies. In America, we try to legislate the morality of drinking. And it does not work. It does not work at all. The actual outcome of prohibition is, like, say, organized crime and a lot worse alcohol, a lot worse health standards. So eventually, when FDR is elected in 1933, he's like, you know what? I guess America needs a drink. And once we repeal prohibition, the first and only time that a constitutional amendment, number 18, is repealed by another amendment, number 21, we actually see the consumption of alcohol go down. I'm just about back to where it was beforehand. And because now there's standards for the alcohol that's going to be used in production, it's a safer alcohol. It's made by professional brewers. So there's some crazy stuff going on in the 1920s as well. And let's start out this list with the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan, the Triple K. Now, the second coming of the Klan actually originates in 1915, and it gets its kind of hailing call from the movie Birth of a Nation. And this film is actually the first motion picture to be shown in the White House. Kind of a terrible legacy when you think of it, the first movie being such a racist movie shown in our White House. In this movie, however, President Woodrow Wilson is cited as kind of a historian as well, of sorts, in the movie itself. So it's interesting that there's so much under the surface tension that's now becoming mainstream, and it's okay to be racist again. And, it's as if like segregation, Jim Crow laws, and the black codes weren't enough animosity towards the African American population, but now we're also going to allow the KKK to come back into existence. So it's a whole heap of problems. The second coming of the KKK, they decided that they're going to target even more people than just Republicans and African Americans. This time, the second KKK is going to target immigrants, especially immigrants who come from places that don't really align to American values as they see it. They're going to attack Catholics, prostitutes, other communists, and fascists. They're going to target, of course, the African American populations, but basically anyone who's not a Protestant white male. So that includes some of the women's movements, which is weird because the women actually had their own group inside the KKK. Young kids, young girls even had a group inside the KKK. Some of the more assimilated aliens or immigrants would actually be given and allowed to march in some of the KKK movements and rallies because they also had their own little section inside it. It's very interesting stuff going on. But whenever you hear of the Ku Klux Klan popping up, well, it's never a good thing. And in this case, it happens right at the tail end of World War I, and it gets bigger, and it leads to a lot of problems. So there's already some animosity and fear going on in the country at this time. We already have the Soviet Union established during World War I, when Russia actually had to pull out of the First World War. We have this global call for workers of our workers' unions and everywhere in the world to join in this communist push. We have a growing number of immigrants coming into the United States who aren't really assimilating at the American level of expectation into American culture, which again is kind of double talk because the country is supposed to be an area and a center for a melting pot of cultures. We borrow some culture here and there, and out comes Korean tacos and weird little blends of food and other aspects of culture. That's what America was supposed to be. So it's interesting that so much animosity is thrown at immigrants during the 1920s. The first Red Scare really pops up at the tail end of World War I, and 1919, 1920 is probably the height of it. Attorney General Palmer at this time is actually of the mind that it's not that big of a deal, and communism is not going to spread into the United States and challenge anything seriously. And then mail bombs start happening, and then worker strikes start happening, and then links to this global communist movement start emerging. Some of it obviously sensationalized, and some of it obviously exaggerated, but the fear's there, and some of the facts that could loosely be attached to it become known facts by everybody. Kind of like reading a headline on Facebook or something in the 21st century. All of a sudden you're an expert on everything with that. So in this case, we see a mail bomb actually attack Palmer's home itself. And at that point, it's like, well, no longer is he saying that the Red Scare is a hoax or anything like that, and the communist expansion isn't real. It's weird. Why on earth would an anarchist actually bomb the house of the U.S. Attorney General, who is out there actually parading around saying that it's not that big of a deal? I mean, it's one of those weird moments in history. Like, what were you thinking, anarchist? But anyways, in response to all this, the Palmer raids began. And this is a moment in American history where we essentially throw out a lot of due process laws and things related to this out the window in the name of let's take care of America and take care of America first. So we see mass deportations. This political cartoon kind of, we'll say it nicely, satirizes it. It is more blessed to give than it is to receive. So we're sending these red communists back to Russia, or back to Italy, or back to some Eastern European bloc state that's okay with this idea of fascism and communism. Weird moment, right? Then we have unlawful searches and mass raids. It's in our first 10 amendments that you need to have a warrant for a search, and we kind of let that go at the command of the U.S. Attorney General, no less. There's a lack of due process. There's mass imprisonment without any kind of justification for holding, which again is against the Constitution. So these Palmer raids and other moments kind of linked with the first Red Scare here in America create a mass panic in the country. And this mass panic turns into anger, and anger into fear, and as Yoda would say, eventually suffering happens. Now the fear of immigrants, specifically those from countries that don't really align with our political values, such as Italy in this case. There's a lot of animosity already towards fascism and anarchism. There's a lot of fear of communism. And then when you actually have people from your community who are already avowed and linked to having fascist tendencies and supporting an overthrow of the U.S. government, when there's an opportunity to place blame on them for something big that happened, of course it's going to get a lot of attention. And unfortunately, there was a murder in 1920 where this actually did happen. So with Sacco and Vanzetti, it's an interesting case of where we see these two immigrants who, again, are avowed fascists. They are anarchists. They're not hiding their core beliefs and values. They're not hiding it at all, and it's very widely known. They're accused of killing a paymaster and his guard, and escaping with about 15,000 of 1920 currency into a car. And it's interesting how the case goes. I'll just read it to you from History Channel and what they actually write on this. On April 15th of 1920, a paymaster for a shoe company in South Braintree, Massachusetts, was shot and killed along with his guard. The murderers, who were described as two Italian men, oh, that's a great description there. That's all they need, right? Escaped with more than $15,000. After going to a garage to claim a car that police said was connected with the crime, Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested and charged with a crime. Although both men carried guns and made false statements upon their arrest, neither had a previous criminal record. On July 14th, 1921, just a few months later, they were convicted and sentenced to die. Now understand, this court case got international attention. Much like a later court case with the Scopes Monkey trial that we're going to talk about, also got a lot of international attention, because this is challenging American values and virtue. If America is supposed to be so awesome and so pro-freedom and democracy, let's see how they actually handle this case where two immigrants are being accused of murder and really high theft. Now, the anti-radical sentiment going on in America at this time led to this trial becoming very sensational, of course. And authorities during the trial, they couldn't actually prove anything. It was very interesting. And in 1925, understand, they're actually held in jail from 1921, when they are indeed convicted, to 1927, when they're finally executed. So it's a long time in jail if you look at it. But 1925, one guy, Celestino Medeiros, actually confesses that he participated in the murder and the theft with the Joe Morelli gang. Well, the state Supreme Court doesn't really care. Massachusetts governor even says, doesn't matter. Because in their eyes, justice had been served. And now the guy's just waiting on death row. it gets very interesting later on, because then we see bombs that are set off in New York City and Philadelphia. On August 23rd, 1927, the two guys, Sacco and Vanzetti, are finally electrocuted to death. Now, in modern times, because a lot of times in history, especially 20th century issues, we can use modern forensic techniques and technology and take a look at things. One case, the bombing of the USS Maine in Havana, Cuba. Here, in 1961, a test is actually run of the gun that belonged to Sacco. And apparently it's actually proved that that gun and its ballistic actually matches the gun that killed the guard. Now, there's no evidence that actually substantiates Vanzetti, his friend's guilt in the murder case. But in 1977, the new Massachusetts governor, Dukakis, actually issues a proclamation vindicating both of them, stating that they had been treated unjustly and that no stigma should be associated with their names. But the damage has been done. Sacco and Vanzetti goes down in history as a really widely publicized and criticized court case in America, where our values were not upheld, where a lot of nonsense and a lot of legitimate fact-finding proved that there wasn't enough to actually say beyond the shadow of a doubt that these two guys murdered these two individuals. So it's interesting that goes on, but that is how prolific the Red Scare fear and this fear of immigrant groups, especially of those from South and Eastern Europe, were in the 1920s. So let's continue here. Now here is a picture of what's going on later on in the 1920s with the Scopes trial in Tennessee, I believe. There was this resurgence of Protestant beliefs and values in America, especially in rural America. Remember, this is a time period where rural traditional values are kind of having to face off and conflict with new modern, urban, contemporary ideals. And one of those cases is going to be the issue of what we teach in public school. Now, Scopes was a biology teacher, and as a biology teacher, of course, he's going to have to come up with how he wants to teach and what he wants to cover for the idea of creationism versus evolution and Darwin's theories. The state government, the State Board of Education, had actually passed laws saying that we're not going to be teaching evolution in public schools. Well, Scopes, as a scientist and as a teacher, takes it upon himself, and he knowingly breaks the law here, and he teaches evolution inside his class. So, of course, he is brought into a court case, and this becomes another highly contentious traditional versus new urban view of things. From the fundamentalist standpoint of those who are part of the Protestant religions at this time, if we're teaching stuff against the Bible inside public school, then well, how are we actually, and why are we paying school taxes, and what exactly else is going on that we're not aware of? And I mean, let's face it, whenever there's an issue that has to deal with education, what's taught inside a classroom, it's always a contentious issue. Always is. This is no exception. So we have two of the greatest lawyers of the 1920s kind of showing up to defend both sides. We have Clarence Darrow, who is going to defend the urban standpoint of things. And then we have this guy who's been in American history seemingly like every decade since the 1890s. We have William Jennings Bryan, who is going to come in and defend the Protestant, the fundamentalist, the traditional viewpoint. In the end, the court case, it's pretty easy to figure out. We have Scopes, who broke a State Board of Education law, so he's found guilty. All right. But the damage is done, and the question is now raised. Do we actually teach evolution inside schools? Do we teach creationism now in a public school as one possible explanation for how we got where we are, or do we just skip over it? And do we teach evolution as a theory, or do we teach it as fact? So these kind of debates have continued to go on well into the 21st century. But in the 1920s, this was the interaction and the tipping point between fundamentalist views and those of the more newer urban majority population. So that is a look at the 1920s. I hope this helps out in your studies. Don't forget to complete the other activities assigned in the unit.